everyone, Carl from INC Live once again for the post-fight recap show. I want to start off by giving an apology for not doing the recap for Whittaker vs Gastelum last weekend. A lot of my time was focused on doing the pre-fight stuff for the pay-per-view, so unfortunately never got the chance to do it. I hope we can make amends though, as we talk about UFC 261. 3 title fights, a big grudge match as our main event. Let's get to the fights. Now, to start off with, we need to talk about the big elephant in the room, or in this case, the 15,000 of them. First time in 13 months, the UFC has held an event in front of a capacity crowd in Jacksonville. And from my own personal perspective, without really getting too political, I wasn't too sold on the idea of UFC doing this show in front of a capacity crowd. The situation in Florida is still very uncertain, and the UFC built a lot of goodwill for the way that they've handled the sort of pandemic era, the shows with the Apex and Fight Island. And I feared they were going to undo a lot of that hard work by jumping so quickly to doing capacity crowds again. That being said, I'm not going to lie, it certainly helped the viewing experience. I think there's been a lot of great shows which have taken place at the Apex. I thought UFC 256, for example, that was a fantastic main card. But I think for the big shows where you got 3 title fights, where you got a stacked main card, you need the crowd's involvement. And when you listen to those Fight Pass prelims, you listen to the reaction that Canelozzi was getting, first fighter out, and the first fight of the prelims. That was almost like GSP in Canada. The crowd were fired up for it, and I think especially for those early fights, those fighters upped their game because of the crowd's involvement. And obviously we'll get into those in a bit more detail later on. So on the whole, even though I dislike the wooing, even though I dislike them booing anytime anybody went for any sort of takedown, there was more positives than there were negatives. The big negative I did have though was the way they treated Weili. I think the build to her versus Rose was very political. I don't think Rose came across the best with some of the comments. So it was disappointing in my opinion to see the crowd so hostile towards Weili when a lot of the reasons for that were out of Weili's control. I don't think it affected Weili's performance, but she seemed disappointed at the way that she was treated, and frankly I did too, so that was a big knock against the crowd. More positives than negatives, and as much as I have enjoyed some of the Apex shows without the crowds, and I do like the approach we're taking where we're still doing the majority of the shows at the Apex, the positives outweigh the negatives. Prologue over, let's get to the serious stuff. Kamaru Usman retains the welterweight title with a second round knockout of Jorge Masvidal. A lot of us did expect this result. Jorge was a 4-1 underdog. Usman had made big steps forward with his striking, as we'd seen in the Gilbert fight. I don't think anyone expected it to happen like that though. A vicious knockout strike. Now Jorge has been finished before. We saw Toby Amada do that by submission. I think Chiesa has submitted him before. Rodrigo Dam did stop him with strikes, but it was a dubious one. I don't think that Jorge was fully out. Maybe the ref stepped in a bit too early. Nobody has ever one-shot put Jorge out in the way that Kamaru Usman did. And this was a guy who a lot of people mocked, ridiculed, decried as being just a clinch wrestler who would hold people against the fence and claim a decision. I was a little surprised to see Usman so content to strike during the fight. I thought since he had so much success in 251 with the wrestling heavy game, it would make sense to go down that same road. And there were times where he loaded up on his shots a bit too much, and Jorge did have the chance to capitalize. But in all honesty, I mean, Jorge landed a couple of flying knees, he did time a couple of uppercuts, but outside of that, there wasn't that much that came from Jorge's side. I wonder at times if Jorge disrespected Usman's power. Now bear in mind, he'd been in there for 25 minutes before, he knew what Usman was capable of in terms of striking. So I wonder if maybe he just thought, hey, if I just work on my takedown defense, my takedown recovery, try and cause him some problems with elbows on the ground. And to be fair, Jorge did do that, which was one of the things I did like about him. He just thought, hey, as long as I work on that side of my game, it's going to be free reign once it gets to the striking. And then for Usman to land that rocket in the way that he did, that to me shows the evolution of Kamaru Usman. 9 months ago, he started working with Whitman, and he's gone from a guy who was struggling to outstrike Colby Covington to doing that to Jorge Masvidal. Now, we talked in the preview show, if you ever go back to watch it, the possibility of Usman starting this sort of GSP style reign of 9, 10, 11 title defenses, turning over opponent after opponent. That's become an even bigger possibility after last night. Now, he's not unbeatable. We saw how Colby pushed him. We saw that Gilbert dropped him early in the fight. The omens, though, don't look good if you're in the welterweight rankings. If he continues to progress in the way that he has done, I struggle to see someone beating him short term. Now, another big question is what's going to happen with Jorge. We questioned how much star power he still had, given he lost to Usman first time around. Some of his behaviour outside the octagon hasn't been great. That stock's only going to lower now, given how he lost his fight. Not so much that he lost, because we've seen other big name fighters lose and still maintain a big level of popularity. But to be one shot by a guy that a lot of people have decried as being just a wrestler, that's going to sting. I could sort of see him entering sort of like Nate Diaz, sort of Conor celebrity fighter route. Giving him fights with no ranking benefit, but they're going to pull casual fans. So I think a rematch with Diaz, Nick if he can get down to welterweight, Conor if he loses to Dustin, anything that sort of fits that sort of BMF image like he likes to paint for himself. What I think we can agree on though is I don't think we're going to see Jorge Masvidal fighting for a title belt anymore. I think that side of Jorge is done. He's still going to be somewhat relevant. I could still maybe see him headlining a pay-per-view. Maybe him versus Diaz BMF2, I could certainly see at Madison Square Garden, for example. But we won't see him challenging for a legitimate belt. Speaking of over quickly, full main event. I had really high hopes for this one. I saw what Xiang really went through against Joanna, and she was facing a fighter in Rose who was faster, better footwork, not afraid to get into a brawl herself. I thought we could have a potential Fight of the Year candidate on our hands. But if I'm going to be wrong, that is a good way to be wrong. 70 seconds, head kick, Rose Namajunas, strawweight champion once again. The first female fighter in UFC history to regain her belt. The head kick has always been one of Rose's most underrated weapons in my opinion. Her footwork's so good, she's able to hide it from her opponents. They're not able to realise until right at the last second what Rose is going to throw. We saw her do that when she fought Michelle Waterson, and again last night with Wei Lee. And they often say the shots that you don't see coming are the ones which hurt the most. And we know Wei Lee can take a punch after what we saw against Joanna. So either Joanna is one of the most pillow-fisted fighters to ever live, or Rose timed that shot to perfection. Now, I admit we've seen some championship fighters given more time to recover than what Wei Lee did, so you might argue that the stoppage was maybe a bit too premature. But the right call was made. You could see that with the way that Wei Lee was reacting. Once she started realising, she argued against the decision instantly. And then once she started to come around and realise, hey, I just got knocked out. Referee made the right call. I do get the impression, though, that the UFC, I should say, didn't want this result. They were going very heavy on the marketing around Wei Lee. They had a lot of Chinese fighters on the card. They pushed the idea of her cleaning out the other former champions, potentially facing Shev as a double champ. That's gone now. And while I love the prospect of Rose as champion, a lot of the matches for her in the short term aren't as compelling as they maybe would have been with Wei Lee as champ. Because you know the UFC would have loved like her versus Xiang as an all Chinese clash, moving up to face Shevchenko, rematch with Joanna, fighting Carla, trying to clean out the other strawweight champion. But strawweight is still in a very strong place. And I'm interested to see Rose taking on the new guard, people like Xiang, Mackenzie Dern, Amanda Hebas, if she can get herself back into contention. Strawweight is a very exciting division, and Rose, I think, is going to be a very good figurehead of that. As for the third title fight, Valentina Shevchenko, now I'm admittedly a big Jessica Andrade fan, and I tried doing my best on the preview to sell her chances of winning. I still stand by my belief that she deserved more than 5% of people picking her to win. But with that being said, this wasn't competitive. Shev looked fantastic out there, and if anything, I think she seemed to savour the prospect of facing a higher level opponent. I think at times when she fought against Jennifer Maia, she was maybe a little too slack, but a takedown and trip game was on point, and I don't think Andrade expected Shevchenko to have this sort of clinch and grappling heavy approach. I was a little concerned when Andrade just seemed to power up from the first takedown, but she persisted with it, and Andrade just seemed to have no answer when she was on the ground. Now, there was one moment in the second round when Andrade managed to get a high leg single, And normally she'd chuck those girls over her shoulder. We've seen her, but we saw what we saw against Chukasian. That once you got a hold of Chukasian, who was a far bigger fighter than even Shevchenko, she was just going for a ride. Once Shev bulked that takedown, it was game over. That was Andrade's only weapon and she stopped it. It was a massive statement win for Shev, given how good and how tough Andrade is, and she made it look easy. I think women's flyweight has gotten a lot better over the past 12 months. I've been quite vocal about that if you follow me on Twitter. And there are a lot of talented girls entering the rankings, getting into the top 15. But in the short term, I'm struggling to see someone who's going to be competitive with Shevchenko. The likelihood is she's going to be facing the Lauren Murphy, Joanne Calderwood winner. And I think regardless of who wins that fight, you're going to get a good story. Obviously, I love JoJo being a Brit, and obviously she's come close to getting a title fight so many times before. Lauren Murphy's had a great career turnaround, so a 38-year-old single mom finally putting all together to get a title fight, that's going to be a good story as well. But in terms of making this a tough match against Shevchenko, that's going to be a harder sell. Shev is capable of having off nights. We saw that against Maya. But if she performs the way she did against Andrade, she could I could see her breaking Ronda's title defense record. Because Ronda has it at the moment at bantamweight 6. I can see Shevchenko getting 7 or 8 at the rate she's going, especially if she fights the way she did last night. In terms of some footnotes, the first 2 fights on the card, Carnelossi and Xiang, Molina and Keeling, fantastic matches. The latter got fights of the night deservedly. And I think they were the 2 fights where the crowd's input had the most influence. Anthony Smith, I thought he looked great even before Jimmy Crute suffered his injury. I think his jab was on point, and I didn't expect Smith to be competitive at all. I picked Crute to win that one fairly comfortably. He looked very good out there. For us to have 2 injuries though, and that's a real big dark point of the show, was what happened to Jimmy Crute and Chris Weidman. Considering Weidman's involvement in Anderson Silva's leg break, it felt very eerie to see that happen to him. And I've got this awful feeling that given his age, the injury, his recent form, we might not see Chris Weidman back in the UFC. And that would be a real shame because I know how good Chris Weidman is. People write off the Anderson wins for their respective reasons. Anderson was taunting too much, and of course the leg break in the second fight. He was winning those fights even before those moments. And then when you mention Damian Maia, Machida, Belfort, he beat a great portfolio of fighters. And in his prime, hell of a good wrestler. And that's the Chris Weidman I want people to remember, not the guy who was writhing in pain after a frankly awful injury. It's not nice watching. That's just my own take though. If you agree or disagree, then please post a comment, like, share, subscribe the video. Next week, we're going to be back in the Apex for Dominic Reyes versus Yuri Prochazka. I hope to get a video out for that one. I hope you can tune in to watch it as well. This is the INC. Thank you for watching.